The gas lamps flickered in the cold Boston night of December 1897 as a small crowd gathered outside the Massachusetts Institute of Scientific Research. Inside that building, something was happening that would shake the foundations of everything scientists believed about the human mind. A 13-year-old black girl named Lydia Johnson stood at a chalkboard, her small hands moving faster than the professors could follow, solving mathematical equations that had stumped some of the brightest minds in America. The men in their expensive suits watched in stunned silence, their notebooks falling from their trembling hands. This wasn't supposed to be possible, not from a child, not from a girl, and certainly not from someone who had taught herself everything from books she found in the garbage. But what happened that night was just the beginning of a story so strange, so impossible, that over a century later, historians still can't explain it. Lydia Johnson would become the subject of secret experiments, newspaper scandals, and an obsession that would consume some of Boston's most powerful men. And then, just when the world was starting to pay attention, she vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that science still cannot answer. Before we dive into this mystery, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about genius, race, and the dark secrets hidden in America's most respected institutions. Trust me, you'll want to be here when we reveal what really happened to Lydia Johnson. This is her story, and it starts with a little girl who could do the impossible. On a freezing January morning in 1897, Professor Edmund Whitmore arrived at his office at Harvard University to find an unusual letter waiting on his desk. The envelope was cheap, the kind poor families bought from corner stores, and the handwriting was careful but unpracticed. Inside was a mathematical proof that solved a problem Whitmore had published in a scientific journal 3 months earlier. A problem so complex that only a handful of mathematicians in the entire country had even attempted it. What made his hands shake as he read wasn't just that someone had solved it. It was that the solution was perfect, elegant, and used a method he had never seen before. At the bottom of the page, in that same careful handwriting, were the words, "From Lydia Johnson, age 13, Roxbury, Massachusetts." Whitmore's first reaction was anger. This had to be a joke, probably from one of his colleagues, trying to make him look foolish. A 13-year-old solving university-level mathematics was absurd enough. But a 13-year-old from Roxbury, Boston's poorest neighborhood, where black families lived in crowded tenements, was simply impossible. He crumpled the letter and threw it in his wastebasket. But something nagged at him throughout the day. That method, that unique approach to the problem, it showed a mind that understood mathematics, not as memorized rules, but as a language. A way of seeing patterns that most adults never grasped. 2 days later, Whitmore did something he would later regret. He traveled to Roxbury with the letter, determined to expose this hoax and find out which mathematician was really behind it. The address led him to a crumbling 3-story building where 5 families shared a single bathroom. He climbed stairs that creaked under his weight, past walls stained with water damage and peeling paint, until he reached a door on the 3rd floor. A tired woman in a faded dress answered, her hands rough from years of washing other people's clothes. When he asked for Lydia Johnson, the woman's face showed confusion and then fear. White men from Harvard didn't knock on doors in Roxbury unless something was very wrong. Lydia appeared behind her mother, a small girl with dark skin and eyes that seemed too old for her face. She wore a dress that had been mended so many times, the original fabric was barely visible. Whitmore held up the letter, his voice sharp with accusation, demanding to know who really wrote it. The girl looked at the paper, then at him, and said quietly that she had made a mistake in the 3rd line. She pointed to a symbol and explained that while her solution worked, there was a more efficient path she had thought of after mailing the letter. Then, standing there in that dark hallway that smelled of boiled cabbage and mildew, she wrote the improved solution in the air with her finger, explaining each step with a clarity that made Whitmore's throat go dry. He stumbled backward, nearly falling down the stairs. This wasn't possible. The girl had no books, no education, no access to the universities and libraries where mathematical knowledge was kept. Her mother couldn't read. Her father had died 2 years earlier in a factory accident. Yet here she stood, explaining advanced mathematics as easily as other children recited nursery rhymes. Whitmore left that building knowing his entire understanding of human intelligence had just shattered into pieces, and he had no idea how to put it back together. Professor Whitmore couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that small girl in her patched dress, writing invisible equations in the air with such confidence that it made his decades of education feel meaningless. By morning, he had made a decision that would change Lydia Johnson's life forever, though not in the way anyone expected. He convinced 3 other Harvard professors to accompany him back to Roxbury, bringing with them a collection of mathematical and scientific texts, puzzles, and problems that even their best graduate students struggled with. They needed to know if what he witnessed was real, or if somehow this child had memorized one solution through some incredible fluke. What happened over the next 6 hours in that cramped apartment would be documented in journals that universities kept hidden for over 50 years. The professors spread their materials across the Johnson family's wobbly kitchen table while Lydia's mother watched nervously from the corner, wringing her apron in her hands. They started with geometry problems that required complex spatial reasoning. Lydia glanced at the diagrams and provided answers before the professors finished reading the questions. They moved to algebra, then calculus, then physics problems involving motion and force. Each time, the girl's responses came quickly, but more disturbing to the professors was how she explained her thinking. She described numbers as having personalities, equations as telling stories, and mathematical relationships as things she could see, like colors in the air. One professor, a man named Dr. Harrison Chen, who had immigrated from China and faced his own prejudice in Boston's academic circles, asked Lydia where she learned these things. Her answer made the room go silent. She said she taught herself by finding textbooks in the trash behind Beacon Hill mansions, where wealthy families threw away their children's school books when they got new editions. She would take these damaged books, sometimes with pages missing or covers torn off, and read them by candlelight after her mother fell asleep. When she didn't understand something, she said the numbers would talk to her in dreams, showing her how the patterns worked. She had been doing this since she was 7 years old. The professors exchanged glances that mixed wonder with something darker. Dr. Chen pulled out a problem that he himself had been working on for 2 years, a theoretical question about probability that had no known solution. He presented it to Lydia, almost as a test of fate, not really expecting anything. The girl stared at the page for nearly 20 minutes, the longest she had taken with any problem. The room grew tense. Her mother brought water that no one drank. Finally, Lydia picked up a pencil and began writing on the back of one of the papers. Her solution took 3 pages of calculations that grew increasingly complex. Using mathematical notation, the professors recognized but combined in ways they had never seen. When she finished, she looked up at Dr. Chen and apologized for taking so long.
Dr. Chen's hands shook as he reviewed her work. Tears formed in his eyes. The solution was not only correct, but opened doors to other mathematical questions he hadn't even thought to ask. The other professors crowded around, their academic pride crumbling as they realized they were in the presence of something that should exist according to every theory of intelligence their society had built. This wasn't just genius. This was something their science had no words for, no way to measure, and no explanation that wouldn't destroy everything they believed about race, gender, and the human mind. Word of Lydia Johnson spread through Boston's scientific community like wildfire, but not in the way one might hope. In the gentlemen's clubs where professors gathered for brandy and cigars, her name was whispered with a mixture of fascination and fear. These were men who had built their entire careers on theories that said intelligence was distributed along racial and gender lines, with white men at the top of a natural hierarchy they believed God himself had designed. Lydia Johnson didn't just challenge these theories, she demolished them completely. And for many of these men, their reputations and livelihoods depended on her not existing. Within 2 weeks of that first test, Lydia's family began receiving visitors. Some came with genuine scientific curiosity, but others arrived with measuring tapes and calipers, instruments designed to measure skull size and facial features. They wanted to examine Lydia physically, to find some biological explanation for her abilities that would fit into their existing theories about race. Her mother, Margaret Johnson, stood in the doorway and refused them entry, her voice firm, despite the fear in her eyes. She had already lost a husband to a factory that valued profit over safety. She would not lose her daughter to men who saw her as a specimen rather than a child. But the Johnson family was poor, and poverty makes people vulnerable in ways that wealth never has to consider. Margaret worked 14-hour days doing laundry for rich families, scrubbing clothes until her fingers bled, earning barely enough to keep a roof over their heads. When Dr. Samuel Morton appeared at their door in March of 1897, he came with an offer that seemed like a miracle. He was a physician with connections to wealthy donors, and he promised that if Margaret allowed him to study Lydia under proper scientific conditions, he would ensure the girl received a real education at a private academy. He would pay for everything: her books, her clothes, her room and board. All he asked was permission to document her abilities and understand how her mind worked. Margaret Johnson was not an educated woman, but she was not foolish either. She asked Dr. Morton what kind of studying he meant, and his answer was smooth as silk. Simple observations, he said, testing her abilities in a controlled environment, measuring her progress as she received proper instruction. He showed Margaret letters from respected institutions, promises of opportunities that no black girl in America had ever received. He painted a picture of Lydia's future that included university education, perhaps even travel to Europe, where the scientific community would celebrate rather than fear her gifts. What mother could say no to such possibilities when the alternative was watching her brilliant daughter waste away in a tenement, her genius buried under poverty's weight? What Dr. Morton did not tell Margaret was that he was part of a group called the American Society for Racial Science, an organization dedicated to proving the biological superiority of the white race. They had been thrown into crisis by Lydia's existence. If one black girl could possess such intelligence, their entire worldview collapsed. They needed to study her. Yes, but not to celebrate her genius. They needed to explain it away, to find some abnormality, some defect that made her an exception rather than evidence that their theories were lies. Dr. Morton had spent months preparing for this moment, researching how to approach the family, what promises would sound most appealing, how to gain access to the girl whose mind threatened everything his colleagues had built their careers upon. Margaret Johnson signed papers she could barely read, trusting a man whose smile hid intentions as dark as the century he represented. She believed she was saving her daughter's future. She had no way of knowing she was handing Lydia over to people who saw her as a problem that needed to be solved. In April of 1897, Lydia Johnson was taken from her mother's apartment to a large brick building on the outskirts of Boston that Dr. Morton called an educational facility. Margaret was allowed to visit once a week on Sunday afternoons, always in the presence of staff members who watched every interaction with clipboards in their hands. The building looked respectable from the outside, with white columns and carefully maintained gardens, but inside it was something between a school and a laboratory. Lydia was given a private room with an actual bed, more books than she had ever seen in her life, and 3 meals a day that didn't consist of watery soup and stale bread. For the first few weeks, she thought perhaps her mother had made the right choice. The testing began gradually. Each morning, doctors and professors would arrive with new puzzles and problems for Lydia to solve while they observed her through a one-way mirror that she didn't know existed. They recorded everything: how long she took to solve each problem, whether she spoke to herself while working, if she used her fingers to calculate or simply stared into space before writing down answers. They measured her heart rate during difficult problems and took photographs of her facial expressions. The tests themselves weren't cruel, but there was something cold about the way these men studied her, as if she were an insect under glass rather than a human child. Dr. Morton became obsessed with finding a physical explanation for Lydia's abilities. He was convinced that somewhere in her body there had to be an abnormality that explained everything. Perhaps her brain was larger than normal, or shaped differently. Maybe her eyes processed information in an unusual way. He spent hours examining her, shining lights into her pupils, testing her reflexes, measuring the span of her fingers and the length of her limbs. He kept detailed journals filled with sketches and measurements, comparing Lydia's physical features to charts that claimed to show the characteristics of different races. Each time his measurements came back normal, his frustration grew more visible. The other scientists had their own theories. One believed Lydia's abilities came from some form of mental illness, that her genius was actually a symptom of madness that would eventually destroy her. He would ask her strange questions designed to detect insanity, becoming agitated when her answers were perfectly rational. Another professor was convinced she was somehow cheating, that she had memorized vast quantities of information and was simply recalling it rather than truly understanding. He created increasingly complex problems designed to catch her in a mistake, growing angry each time she solved them with ease. These men had spent their entire lives believing in their own intellectual superiority. Having it challenged by a 13-year-old black girl from a slum was more than their egos could handle. But it was Dr. Morton who crossed lines that even his colleagues found disturbing. In July of 1897, he proposed an experiment that he claimed would finally unlock the mystery of Lydia's mind. He wanted to perform a procedure that involved opening her skull to examine her living brain, to see if there were physical differences that explained her abilities. He presented this idea at a meeting of the American Society for Racial Science, with diagrams and medical references, arguing that the potential knowledge justified the risk. Several doctors in the room objected, not on moral grounds, but because they believed Lydia was too valuable to risk losing. The debate grew heated, with men shouting over each other about scientific progress versus practical considerations. What none of them seemed to consider was that Lydia could hear them. The meeting room shared a wall with the library where she spent her afternoons, and the ventilation system carried their voices clearly. She sat perfectly still among her books, listening to men discuss cutting open her head as casually as they might debate dissecting a frog. The night Lydia overheard the doctors discussing surgery on her brain, something changed in her. She had spent months being the obedient subject, solving their puzzles and answering their questions, believing that cooperation would eventually lead to the education Dr. Morton had promised. But the education never came. There were no real classes, no other students, no teachers who cared about helping her grow. There was only the endless testing, the measuring, the photographs, and now the threat of scalpels cutting into her skull. She realized with a clarity that made her stomach turn that these men didn't want to understand her genius. They wanted to explain it away, to find some defect that would let them maintain their comfortable lies about who deserved to be considered intelligent. On September 12, 1897, the Massachusetts Scientific Society announced a public demonstration that would become one of the most talked about events in Boston's history. Dr. Morton had arranged for Lydia to be presented before an audience of the city's most prominent scientists, doctors, and wealthy patrons who funded scientific research. The event was held at the Old South Meeting House, the same building where revolutionaries had planned the Boston Tea Party over a century earlier. Now it would host a different kind of revolution, though not the one Dr. Morton intended. Tickets were sold for the astronomical price of $5 each, with proceeds going to the American Society for Racial Science. The Boston newspapers promoted the event with headlines that called Lydia everything from a scientific miracle to a curious oddity of nature. Lydia Johnson was given a seat in the front row, dressed in new clothes that Dr. Morton's people had purchased for her. She looked uncomfortable in the fine fabric, her work-hardened hands fidgeting in her lap as the hall filled with hundreds of people who had come to watch her daughter be put on display. The audience was entirely white except for a small group of black community leaders who had heard about the event and attended despite not being officially invited. They sat in the back, their presence a silent protest against what was happening on stage. Lydia was led onto the platform wearing a white dress that made her look even younger than her 13 years. Dr. Morton stood beside her with a collection of chalkboards and mathematical instruments, ready to demonstrate the girl's abilities to prove his theories about racial anomalies. But what happened next shocked everyone in that hall. When Dr. Morton asked Lydia to solve the first problem he had prepared, a complex equation written on the chalkboard behind them, she simply stood there in silence. He repeated the question, his voice taking on an edge of irritation. The audience began to murmur. This was not part of the plan. Then Lydia spoke, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry through the hall. She said she would solve any problem the audience gave her, but not the ones Dr. Morton had prepared. She wanted the men in the audience, the professors and scientists who had paid $5 to watch her perform like a circus animal, to challenge her with their own unsolved problems, the real questions they struggled with in their research, not the rehearsed demonstrations Morton had designed to make himself look brilliant. The hall erupted in shocked whispers. This was unheard of. A child, especially a black child, did not make demands of educated white men. Dr. Morton's face turned red with fury, but before he could speak, a voice called out from the audience. It belonged to Dr. James Richardson, a mathematics professor from MIT who had been skeptical of the entire event. He stood and presented a problem from his own research. a question about fluid dynamics that his team had been working on for 8 months without success. The challenge hung in the air like a dare. Lydia walked to the chalkboard with a composure that seemed impossible for someone her age. The entire hall fell silent. Hundreds of eyes watching as she picked up a piece of chalk and stared at Dr. Richardson's problem written across the board. For nearly 3 minutes she stood motionless, and people began shifting in their seats, wondering if perhaps the girl's abilities had been exaggerated after all. Dr. Morton's confidence started returning to his face. Then Lydia's hand began to move, and what happened next would be discussed in scientific circles for decades. She didn't just solve the problem. She tore it apart and rebuilt it, showing 3 different approaches that each revealed something new about the underlying mathematics. Her chalk moved across the board so fast that it squeaked, filling the space with equations and diagrams that seemed to flow from her mind like water from a spring. She spoke as she wrote, explaining her reasoning in language that was both technically precise and remarkably clear. Even people in the audience with no mathematical training could follow the logic of what she was doing. When she finished, she turned to Dr. Richardson and apologized for taking so long, then pointed out a small error in how he had originally framed the question that had been making the problem harder than it needed to be. The hall exploded. Scientists jumped to their feet, some shouting questions, others arguing with each other about the validity of her methods. Dr. Richardson stood frozen, his mouth open, staring at the chalkboard as if it had just revealed the secrets of the universe. Another professor immediately called out his own problem. Then another, and another. For the next 2 hours, Lydia Johnson stood at that chalkboard and demolished every challenge thrown at her. She solved problems in physics, chemistry, advanced mathematics, even theoretical questions that had no known answers. With each solution, the audience's reaction grew more intense. Some men were angry, their faces red as they insisted there must be some trick. Others looked terrified, as if the natural order of their world was crumbling before their eyes. But there were also men who saw something different that day. Dr. Chun, the Harvard professor who had first tested Lydia months earlier, stood with tears streaming down his face, clapping until his hands hurt. Several younger scientists in the audience began to question everything they had been taught about intelligence and human potential. The black community leaders in the back of the hall sat with quiet dignity, their faces showing both pride and deep sadness, knowing that this moment of triumph would likely bring Lydia nothing but more danger from men who could not accept what she represented. Dr. Morton tried repeatedly to regain control of the event, but he had lost the audience completely. His carefully planned demonstration meant to showcase his theories about racial science had backfired spectacularly. Instead of proving Lydia was an abnormality, she had proven that genius could emerge from anywhere, from any person, regardless of what prejudice claimed was possible. The newspapers the next day ran wild stories. Some called her the greatest mathematical mind of the century. Others published vicious articles claiming the whole event was a fraud orchestrated by abolitionists trying to promote racial equality. The debate raged across Boston and spread to other cities. But Lydia Johnson barely had time to read those newspapers. 3 days after her performance at Old South Meeting House, she disappeared. Margaret Johnson arrived for her Sunday visit to find her daughter's room empty, the bed neatly made, all of her books gone. Dr. Morton claimed Lydia had been moved to a better facility for advanced study, but he refused to say where. Margaret demanded answers, threatened to go to the police, but no one would help a poor black woman make accusations against respected white doctors. The disappearance of Lydia Johnson remains one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. Despite Margaret Johnson's desperate searches, despite newspaper investigations, despite pressure from the few scientists who genuinely cared about the girl's welfare, no trace of Lydia was ever found. After September 15, 1897, Dr. Morton claimed she had been sent to a private institution in Europe for advanced study. But no records of her arrival exist in any European university or scientific academy. Other members of the American Society for Racial Science gave conflicting stories, some saying she had returned to her family, others claiming she had died from a sudden illness. Every lead went nowhere. Every document trail went cold. Margaret Johnson spent the rest of her life searching for her daughter. She died in 1923, still believing that somewhere, somehow, Lydia was alive. In her final days, she told neighbors that she regretted ever signing those papers. ever trusting Dr. Morton's promises of education and opportunity. She blamed herself for what happened, though the real blame belonged to a society so committed to its lies about racial superiority that it would rather destroy a child's future than admit those lies were false. What makes Lydia's story even more tragic is what happened to the evidence of her genius. In 1901, a fire mysteriously destroyed the offices of the American Society for Racial Science, and with it went most of the documentation of Lydia's tests and demonstrations. The few papers that survived were scattered among private collections, hidden away by families embarrassed that their ancestors had been part of such a dark chapter. It wasn't until the 1970s that historians began piecing together what really happened, interviewing elderly people who had attended that famous demonstration, searching through old newspapers and personal letters for any mention of the girl who had challenged everything science believed. Some historians believe Lydia was institutionalized in an asylum, a common fate for people who made powerful men uncomfortable. Others think she may have been sent away under a different name, her identity erased to hide the embarrassment she caused. The darkest theories suggest that Dr. Morton's proposed surgery actually happened in secret, that Lydia died on an operating table in some hidden facility where doctors could experiment without oversight or consequences. We will probably never know the truth. But here's what we do know, for certain. In 1897, a 13-year-old black girl from Boston's poorest neighborhood demonstrated intellectual abilities that the greatest scientific minds of her era could not explain. She solved problems that stumped professors with decades of education. She showed the world that genius has no color, no gender, no requirement for wealth or privilege. And for that crime, for daring to be brilliant in a world that demanded she'd be invisible, she was erased from history. Lydia Johnson's story is not just about one remarkable girl. It's about how many other brilliant minds were destroyed by prejudice, how much human potential was wasted because society valued comfort over truth. It makes you wonder how many other Lydias existed throughout history. Children whose genius was buried under poverty, racism, and fear. How much further along would humanity be if we had actually nurtured every brilliant mind instead of only the ones born into the right families with the right skin color? The next time someone tells you that intelligence or talent or genius belongs to certain groups of people and not others, remember Lydia Johnson. Remember the girl who taught herself advanced mathematics from books she found in the trash. Remember how she stood before hundreds of hostile men and proved them all wrong. And remember that they made her disappear because acknowledging her existence would have meant admitting their entire worldview was built on lies. Lydia Johnson deserved better. She deserved the education she was promised, the opportunities her genius earned, the chance to grow up and show the world what she could achieve. Instead, she got exploitation, medical experimentation, and ultimately erasure. Her story should make us angry. It should make us question what other injustices we re-accepting today that future generations will look back on with horror. And it should make us determined to never let genius be wasted again, regardless of where it comes from. If this story moved you, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss other hidden histories that deserve to be told. And share this video with someone who needs to hear Lydia's story. Her name was almost lost to time. Let's make sure that at least her memory survives, even if she didn't get the chance to.